The other day I was at work, and as a security officer, I get a lot of questions about police. You know, a lot of the times I'll joke about how police are my richer, older cousins. Because we do similar things as guards, as security guards, not necessarily always the same things, but a lot of the times the difference boils down to what I do for private property, police do for public property. Whereas police don't have jurisdiction in private property matters, I don't have jurisdiction in public property matters. But all this is a long way of introducing the fact that I was asked the other day while at work, what about police brutality? What about the police bullying people and kicking people and hurting people and shooting people, unarmed people? What about all of this? Well, of course, it's always wrong for a police officer to abuse the authority that God has granted the state to give to him. It's always wrong. But recently in the news, we've talked about police being shot, murdered, by people who are upset over the brutality of police behavior. And what this person was saying and hinting at and arguing for in his line of questioning was that police deserved the brutality that they received because of the way they behave. I told my colleague and friend at work that no matter how a person behaves, murder is never justified. Killing can be necessary. God's decreed that killing must be done for the self-defense of a nation, for the self-defense of the public safety. Throughout the law, throughout the Bible, many incidents are recorded where God demanded the killing of people for the preservation of peace, for the preservation of the safety of the people. And we entrust the power of the sword, the power of the weapon, with police officers to preserve the public peace. And when police are corrupt, when police are vile, when police are murderous, we have systems in place, internal affairs offices and multiple police agencies to keep a watch on each other, to preserve the public trust when things go wrong. But God has established that we be people who obey the rules, who listen to authority. We read in the Bible, in 2 Peter, chapter 2, that the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from temptation and to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment, and especially those who indulge the flesh in its corrupt desires and despise authority. Daring, self-willed, they do not tremble when they revile even angelic magistrates. There are people who do not care about authority. They do not care about the authority that God has established. As in the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul said, "Let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, he who resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid. For it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath upon the one who practices evil. It is police that, in our modern context, authority, government, has entrusted with the power of the sword. Thankfully, we no longer depend on the army to control riots in the streets, although there's always the potential that society will degrade to that point, especially if we continue heaping abuse, heaping insults upon our police forces. It may become necessary that the army will have to get involved the way it had to get involved in the past when the Apostle Paul was writing this passage. Martial law was frequently declared in Israel and its ancient equivalent. Martial law has been decreed throughout history when a people becomes so rebellious, when a people becomes so abusive against the police, it becomes necessary to preserve the peace to get the army involved. Of course, it's my will that that would never become necessary in the United States, but there's always that risk that if we continue to despise authority, if we continue to despise the people that God has entrusted with the public trust, with the public health, with the public peace, if we rebel, if we refuse to accept and honor our boys in blue, our women in blue, who provide peace and safety and security for the righteous, who are a cause of fear to those who do evil, there is always the possibility that if we continue to declare war on the police, that more extreme measures, not less extreme measures, but more extreme measures will become necessary to defend the public trust. It is my prayer that we would honor those who are in authority, that we would honor those who defend the public safety, who preserve the peace by risking their lives. You know, I spend so much of my life fighting thieves as a security guard. You know, fighting people who, in an evil and wicked way, want to break the rules. And people who break the rules hate those who are in authority. And so I live every day in the middle of this back and forth between those who don't want to obey the rules of society and those who, for the public good, need to enforce the rules. I also see how police behavior can be abusive and how police behavior can be extreme. And, you know, I've had incidents with police myself where the interactions didn't go so well. I felt that the police were being needlessly argumentative, that the police were being needlessly disrespectful. However, because of the realities of their job, because of the pressures that I know that they're under, because of the pressures that I'm under when I'm a guard protecting a public venue or a private venue, I understand how they got and how they maintain the attitude that they have. I also understand that it's our duty to always check our own behavior. It's our private duty to always treat others with respect. And so I understand the tension between the temptation to for a cop to be bad, for a cop to want to just get frustrated and lash out. I also understand the importance of self-discipline, both for us and for the men and women of uniform who defend the peace. And we need to pray for those who are police, but we also need to watch our own behavior with understanding, with grace, with mercy when we interact with people who are disrespectful, who are impatient, whether they are gang members or whether they are police. We all have a responsibility to check our own behavior, because invariably, inevitably, other people will tick us off and will push us to do things that aren't right to do. And it is our duty, it is our responsibility to check our own behavior, to respectfully honor authority, to respectfully obey authority, as long as that authority is not in contradiction with God's word. Any authority that attempts to rebel against God's word has delegitimized its own power at that moment. Not categorically, but at that moment. It has delegitimized its own power. And when a government or when a police officer or when anybody asks us to do an immoral order, an order that goes against God's word, we are duty bound at that point to rebel against the authority that has delegitimized its own position at that one particular point. Not necessarily all of its authority, but certainly at that one point. We are not bound to obey an immoral order. We are not bound to obey an order that rejects the authority, that rejects the principle of God. But we must use such selected civil disobedience wisely, and it must be civil disobedience. We shouldn't use violent disobedience. Violence must be and always a last resort after all other options are exhausted. We must fight for peace. We must contend for peace. And this is an understanding that goes from us civilians to police officers. It's an understanding that must come from police officers to civilians. We all have a duty to do what we can for peace, to do what we can for the preservation of the public safety and the public peace and the preservation of that peace. In our culture, far too often we are encouraged to rebel. In our culture, far too often our rebellion is cloaked under the guise of questioning authority. It is our duty as Christians to be obedient to God by being obedient to the authorities that God has established, as long as what those authorities are saying is not in contradiction with what God is asking of us. Have a good day.